The flickering fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed, casting a sterile glow on Detective Harding's weary face. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture more habit than remedy for the throbbing behind his eyes. Beside him, Detective Ramirez, a whirlwind of restless energy, tapped a pen against a thick file. They were a study in contrasts, Harding the seasoned veteran, world-weary and pragmatic, Ramirez the bright-eyed idealist, fueled by an unwavering belief in justice. Yet, their differences were the bedrock of their success, a finely tuned partnership forged in the crucible of countless unsolved cases. Another one, huh? Harding sighed, the words heavy with resignation. He was referring to the stack of missing persons reports that seemed to multiply overnight, each a silent scream for help in a city that often turned a deaf ear. Ramirez stopped tapping, her gaze hardening. We can't think like that, Harding. Every one of these files represents a life, a family holding on to hope. Harding knew she was right, of course. He just wasn't as good at wearing his optimism on his sleeve. He'd seen too much, the hope gradually eroded by the grim realities of their profession. The faces of the missing haunted his dreams, the runaway teenager, the elderly man with Alzheimer's, the young mother vanished without a trace. Some were found, some weren't. And the ones that weren't. Those were the ones that chipped away at your soul. I know, Harding mumbled, picking up the top file. The picture on the cover was of a young woman with vibrant, smiling eyes and a cascade of auburn hair. Sarah Jenkins. 23 years old. Aspiring artist. Last seen leaving her apartment a week ago. The preliminary report offered nothing concrete, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no apparent motive. Just another ghost in the city's sprawling landscape. Missing persons cases were the bane of their existence. Unlike homicides, where there was a body and a crime scene to investigate, missing persons cases were shrouded in ambiguity. The person could have run away, been kidnapped, gotten lost, or simply wanted to disappear. The possibilities were endless, the leads often non-existent. Ramirez leaned closer, her focus already sharpening. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Harding. We haven't even started digging yet. Maybe this one will be different. Maybe this one we can bring home. Harding wanted to believe her. He really did. But the years had taught him to temper his expectations, to brace himself for the disappointment that almost always followed. He looked at Sarah Jenkins' smiling face again, a pang of sympathy tightening his chest. He knew what was at stake. He knew the clock was ticking. And he knew that in the world of missing persons, time was the enemy. The longer they waited, the dimmer the hope became. The harder it was to bring them home. The Jenkins family home was a small, tidy bungalow in a quiet, tree-lined street. The kind of place where kids played hopscotch on the sidewalk and neighbors exchanged freshly baked pies. But today, the air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. The bright yellow paint seemed to mock the gloom that had settled over the house like a shroud. Inside, Sarah's parents, Robert and Mary, sat huddled together on the sofa, their faces etched with worry. Robert, a retired accountant, looked lost and bewildered, his usually meticulous appearance now disheveled. Mary, a warm and nurturing woman who ran a local daycare, stared blankly ahead, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Sarah's younger brother, David, a lanky teenager with headphones perpetually around his neck, sat awkwardly in an armchair, trying to offer comfort but clearly struggling to process the situation himself. Harding and Ramirez introduced themselves, offering their condolences and assurances that they would do everything in their power to find Sarah. The detectives could feel the family's desperation, their hope clinging to them like a fragile lifeline. She wouldn't just leave, Mary said, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah loved her life here. She loved her art. She was so excited about her upcoming exhibition. Robert nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. She was always so responsible, so reliable. She called us every day. To just disappear. It's not like her. David removed his headphones, his young face etched with concern. She was working really hard on her paintings. She had this new series she was really excited about. Something about the city at night. Ramirez gently guided the conversation, asking about Sarah's friends, her routines, any recent changes in her behavior. The family offered what they could, but it was clear they were grasping at straws, desperate for any clue that might lead to her safe return. They learned that Sarah was a talented artist, dedicated to her craft. She spent most of her time either painting in her small apartment studio or attending classes at the local art center. She had a close circle of friends, all fellow artists, and a supportive family who encouraged her passion. There was no history of mental illness, no financial problems, no known enemies. Just a young woman living a normal life, until one day, she wasn't. The detectives asked about Sarah's relationships, specifically her romantic life. The family mentioned Mark Olson, Sarah's ex-boyfriend. They had dated for about a year, but had broken up a few months ago. The breakup had been amicable, they said, and Sarah seemed to have moved on. As they left the Jenkins home, Harding felt the weight of their despair pressing down on him. He knew the statistics, the grim reality that the longer a person was missing, the less likely they were to be found alive. He glanced at Ramirez, who was scribbling notes in her pad, her brow furrowed in concentration. He knew she felt it too, the urgency, the responsibility. They had to find Sarah. They had to give this family some answers. But where to start? Sarah Jenkins had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a void and a family shattered by uncertainty. Back at the precinct, Harding and Ramirez dove into the meticulous, often tedious, work of building a case. They started with Sarah's apartment, a small, one-bedroom space above a bakery in a gentrifying neighborhood. The aroma of warm bread still lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile atmosphere of a crime scene. The apartment was neat and orderly, reflecting Sarah's organized personality. Canvases lined the walls, showcasing her vibrant and expressive paintings. Brushes were neatly arranged in jars, and tubes of paint were organized by color in a wooden box. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Just an unsettling emptiness, as if Sarah had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. They dusted for fingerprints, collected samples of hair and fibers, and meticulously documented every detail. They examined Sarah's computer, poring over her emails, social media accounts, and browsing history. Nothing stood out, no cryptic messages, no suspicious contacts, no indication that she was planning to leave or that she was in any kind of danger. They interviewed Sarah's friends and colleagues at the art center. They all described her as a kind, talented, and dedicated artist. They were shocked by her disappearance and offered no insights into her possible whereabouts. They confirmed that she had been excited about her upcoming exhibition and had been working tirelessly on her new series of paintings. Mark Olson, the ex-boyfriend, was brought in for questioning. He was cooperative and polite, expressing genuine concern for Sarah's well-being. He claimed that they had parted ways amicably and that he hadn't seen her in weeks. He had a solid alibi for the night she disappeared, attending a concert with friends across town. His story checked out, and there was no apparent reason to suspect him. The detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking residents if they had seen anything unusual. No one had. Sarah had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind no clues, no witnesses, no answers. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation stalled. The initial flurry of activity subsided, replaced by a growing sense of frustration and despair. The leads had dried up, the tips had led nowhere, and the case was growing colder with each passing day. Harding felt the familiar weight of an unsolved case pressing down on him, the gnawing feeling that they were missing something, that there was a piece of the puzzle that they just couldn't find. He knew that time was running out. He knew that the chances of finding Sarah alive were diminishing with each passing hour. He also knew that they had exhausted all the obvious avenues of investigation. They had interviewed everyone, searched everywhere, and found nothing. It was as if Sarah Jenkins had simply ceased to exist. The case was starting to look like another cold case, another file destined to gather dust in the archives, another reminder of the limitations of their profession. Harding could feel the hope slipping away, replaced by the grim acceptance that some mysteries were simply never meant to be solved. The weight of the unsolved case bore down on Harding. He sat at his desk, the Sarah Jenkins file open in front of him, a stark reminder of their failure. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, amplifying the silence of the precinct. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, the frustration of hitting a dead end. He'd been a detective for over 20 years, and he'd seen his share of tragedies, but some cases just stuck with you, burrowed under your skin and refused to let go. Sarah Jenkins was one of those cases. He reread the reports, searching for something they might have missed, some small detail that could unlock the mystery. But the words blurred together, the facts remaining stubbornly unchanged. No witnesses, no motive, no leads. Just a missing young woman and a family desperate for answers. He glanced at Ramirez, who was hunched over her computer, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was still poring over the case files, refusing to give up hope. Harding admired her tenacity, her unwavering belief in the power of investigation. But he also knew that sometimes, no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't solve a case. Sometimes, the truth remained hidden, buried beneath layers of deception or simply lost to the passage of time. Anything? Harding asked, his voice heavy with resignation. Ramirez looked up, her eyes tired but determined. I'm still going through the phone records. I know it's a long shot, but maybe there's something we missed. Harding nodded, but he didn't share her optimism. They had already scrutinized Sarah's phone records, looking for suspicious calls or messages. They had checked her social media accounts, her emails, her browsing history. They had found nothing. I'm thinking of recommending we suspend the active search, Harding said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. We've exhausted all the leads. We're wasting resources that could be used on other cases. Ramirez's eyes widened in disbelief. Suspend the search. Harding, we can't do that. We can't just give up on her. We haven't given up, Harding said, his voice defensive. We're just being realistic. We've done everything we can. There's nothing more we can do. There's always something more we can do, Ramirez insisted, her voice rising. We owe it to Sarah, we owe it to her family, to keep looking. We can't just let her disappear. Harding sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He knew Ramirez was right, but he also knew that they were facing a dead end. The case was cold, the leads were dry, and the chances of finding Sarah alive were slim. He had to make a decision, a difficult decision, but a necessary one. I'll talk to the captain, Harding said, his voice firm. I'll recommend we suspend the active search, but we'll keep the case open. We'll follow up on any new leads that come in. But we can't keep pouring resources into a case that's going nowhere. Ramirez stared at him, her eyes filled with disappointment. She knew she couldn't change his mind. Harding had made his decision, and he wasn't going to back down. The hope that had burned so brightly in her eyes began to flicker, threatened by the harsh reality of their profession. It felt like they were abandoning Sarah, leaving her lost and alone in the vastness of the city. And that was a feeling that Ramirez couldn't easily shake. Harding walked into Captain Miller's office, the Sarah Jenkins file tucked under his arm. The captain, a gruff but fair man with a salt and pepper mustache, looked up from his paperwork. Harding, what can I do for you? I need to talk to you about the Jenkins case, Harding said, placing the file on the captain's desk. Captain Miller leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. Not getting anywhere, huh? No, sir, Harding admitted. We've exhausted all the leads. There are no witnesses, no suspects, no new information. I'm recommending we suspend the active search. The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. I know you've been working hard on this one, Harding. But I also know you're not one to give up easily. Are you sure you've considered everything? Yes, sir, Harding said firmly. We've done everything we can. Continuing the active search would be a waste of resources. Captain Miller nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the Sarah Jenkins file. All right, Harding. I trust your judgment. Suspend the active search. But keep the case open. If any new leads come in, I want you to follow up on them immediately. Yes, sir, Harding said, relief washing over him. He knew it was the right decision, but it still felt like a defeat. Back at his desk, Harding saw Ramirez packing up her things. She avoided his gaze, her movements stiff and deliberate. I'm going to take a few days off, she said, her voice flat. I need some time to clear my head. I understand, Harding said, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew he had disappointed her, but he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. As Ramirez walked out of the precinct, Harding felt a sense of loneliness settle over him. He knew that their partnership had been strained by the Jenkins case, but he hoped that they could eventually move past it. He also knew that he had to be prepared for the possibility that they might never see eye to eye on this one. Days turned into weeks, and the Sarah Jenkins case faded into the background. Other cases came and went, each demanding their attention, their time, their energy. Harding tried to focus on the present, to put the Jenkins case behind him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed Sarah, that he had let her down. He found himself thinking about her vibrant smile, her passion for art, her dreams that had been cut short. He wondered where she was, what had happened to her. He wondered if she was still alive. He knew that he had made the right decision, that suspending the active search was the only logical thing to do. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had given up too soon, that he had missed something, that there was still a chance to bring Sarah home. And that feeling haunted him, day and night. It was a constant reminder of the limitations of his profession, the harsh reality that some mysteries were simply never meant to be solved. The silence of the unsolved case was deafening. Ramirez couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something. Harding's decision to suspend the active search felt like a betrayal, not just to Sarah, but to everything she believed in. She couldn't reconcile herself to the idea of giving up, of letting Sarah become just another statistic. So, instead of taking time off as she had told Harding, she went back to the precinct. The building was quiet, almost deserted. Most of her colleagues were out on assignment, and the few who remained were engrossed in their own cases. She felt a sense of isolation, but it didn't deter her. She was determined to find something, anything, that could reignite the investigation. She started by revisiting the evidence they had already collected, meticulously reviewing every report, every interview, every photograph. She went through Sarah's phone records again, scrutinizing every call, every text message. It was tedious work, but she refused to let her focus waver. Then, she remembered something. During their initial interview with Sarah's mother, Mary had mentioned an old voicemail that Sarah had left her a few weeks before her disappearance. It was nothing important, Mary had said, just Sarah checking in and saying she would be late for dinner. They had listened to the voicemail briefly, but had dismissed it as irrelevant. Ramirez felt a surge of adrenaline. What if they had been too quick to dismiss it? What if there was something in that voicemail that they had missed? She found the file containing the voicemail and plugged in her headphones. Sarah's voice filled her ears, warm and familiar. "Hi Mom, it's me. Just wanted to let you know I'm running a little late for dinner tonight. I got caught up with my painting. Should be there in about an hour. Love you." Ramirez listened to the voicemail again and again, focusing on every nuance of Sarah's voice. She could hear the sounds of the city in the background, the distant rumble of traffic, the faint chatter of voices. It all seemed perfectly normal. But then, she heard it. A faint, muffled sound, barely audible beneath Sarah's voice. It sounded like someone speaking, but the words were indistinct, almost unintelligible. She replayed the voicemail again, focusing on that one brief moment. There it was again. A muffled voice, speaking too softly to be understood. But it was definitely there. And it hadn't been there before. Ramirez felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had found something. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it gave her hope that she might finally be able to unlock the mystery of Sarah Jenkins' disappearance. This wasn't just giving her a new lead, this was a renewed sense of hope, that maybe she wasn't giving up, and maybe, just maybe, she could bring Sarah home. Ramirez knew she couldn't decipher the muffled voice on her own. She needed to take the voicemail to the department's audio forensics expert, a wizened old technician named Mr. Abernathy, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to extract sound from the most obscure recordings. Mr. Abernathy's lab was a dimly lit, cluttered space filled with an array of vintage audio equipment and modern digital processors. He greeted Ramirez with a weary smile, his eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. "What have you got for me, detective?" he asked, his voice raspy from years of working with audio equipment. Ramirez explained her discovery and played the voicemail for him. Mr. Abernathy listened intently, his head cocked to one side, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the console. "I hear it," he said, after the voicemail had finished. "Faint, but definitely there. Sounds like a male voice." He then began the painstaking process of enhancing the audio. He used a series of sophisticated filters and algorithms to isolate the muffled voice, reducing the background noise and amplifying the faintest sounds. It was a slow and laborious process, requiring patience and a keen ear. Hours passed as Mr. Abernathy worked his magic. He tweaked the settings, adjusted the frequencies, and experimented with different techniques. Ramirez watched in anticipation, her hopes rising with each incremental improvement in the audio quality. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Abernathy stopped. He leaned back in his chair, his face etched with concentration. "I think I've got something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's still not perfect, but I can make out a few words." He played the enhanced audio. Sarah's voice was clear and strong, but beneath it, the muffled voice was now slightly more distinct. Ramirez strained her ears, trying to decipher the words. "Don't. Please," the muffled voice seemed to say. Then, a pause, followed by another word, almost swallowed by the background noise. "Leave." Ramirez felt a chill run down her spine. The words were fragmented, incomplete, but they painted a disturbing picture. It sounded like someone pleading, begging someone not to leave. And the fact that it was happening in the background of Sarah's voicemail suggested that she had been in some kind of distress. "Can you clean it up any more?" Ramirez asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "This is as good as it's going to get, detective. Any more enhancement and the audio will become too distorted." Ramirez thanked Mr. Abernathy for his help and left the lab, clutching the enhanced audio file like a precious gem. She now had something concrete, something that could potentially break the case wide open. The muffled voice in the voicemail was a silent scream, a desperate plea for help that had gone unheard for too long. And now, Ramirez was determined to give it a voice. The pursuit of justice was back on. The fragmented words from the voicemail echoed in Ramirez's mind. "Don't. Please. Leave." Who was Sarah talking to? And why was that person pleading with her? The obvious answer, the one that had been lurking in the back of her mind since the beginning, suddenly came into sharp focus: Mark Olson. Mark Olson. Sarah's ex-boyfriend. The man who had seemed so cooperative, so concerned, during their initial interview. The man who had provided a seemingly airtight alibi. But something about him had always bothered Ramirez. A subtle possessiveness in his tone when he spoke about Sarah, a flicker of anger in his eyes when he mentioned their breakup. She had dismissed it at the time, attributing it to the lingering emotions of a recent relationship. But now, with the new evidence from the voicemail, those subtle clues took on a sinister new meaning. Ramirez pulled up Mark Olson's file on her computer. His photograph stared back at her, a handsome young man with piercing blue eyes and a charming smile. But now, Ramirez saw something else in his face, a hint of darkness, a flicker of something unsettling. Mark Olson was 26 years old. He worked as a bartender at a popular downtown nightclub. He had no prior criminal record. He had dated Sarah Jenkins for about a year, but they had broken up 3 months ago, reportedly due to Sarah's desire for more independence. During their initial interview, Mark had claimed that he had been at a concert with friends on the night Sarah disappeared. He had provided the names and contact information of his friends, who had all corroborated his story. It seemed like a solid alibi. But Ramirez knew that alibis could be fabricated, that people could lie. And she had a feeling that Mark Olson was hiding something. The muffled voice in the voicemail, the pleading words, the subtle hints of possessiveness, they all pointed to him. She needed to bring him in for questioning again. But this time, she wouldn't let him off so easily. She would confront him with the enhanced voicemail, with the damning evidence that had been hidden in plain sight all along. She would push him, challenge him, and expose the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Ramirez picked up the phone and dialed Harding's number. It was time to bring him back into the fold. It was time to tell him about the voicemail, about the muffled voice, about Mark Olson. It was time to reopen the Sarah Jenkins case. The pursuit of justice, previously a solo endeavor, was about to become a joint effort once again. The detectives had a mission. Harding, initially skeptical, listened to the enhanced voicemail with Ramirez. He had to admit, the muffled voice was unsettling. And Ramirez's hunch about Mark Olson was starting to make sense. "All right," Harding conceded, "let's bring him in. But we need more than just a hunch and a muffled voice. We need concrete evidence." Ramirez agreed. They needed to definitively link the voice in the voicemail to Mark Olson. They turned to Mr. Abernathy again, asking him to perform a voice comparison analysis. Mr. Abernathy explained that voice comparison was a complex process that involved analyzing various acoustic parameters, such as pitch, tone, speech patterns, and pronunciation. He would need a sample of Mark Olson's voice to compare with the voice in the voicemail. Harding and Ramirez obtained a recording of Mark Olson from their initial interview. Mr. Abernathy then fed both audio samples into his sophisticated voice analysis software. The software generated a series of spectrograms, visual representations of the audio signals, highlighting the unique characteristics of each voice. Days turned into hours as Mr. Abernathy meticulously compared the spectrograms, searching for similarities and differences. He focused on the subtle nuances of Mark Olson's speech, his unique pronunciation of certain words, his distinctive vocal inflections. Finally, he found it. A distinctive speech pattern, a slight lisp that Mark Olson exhibited when pronouncing the letter S. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. And it matched the speech pattern in the muffled voice in the voicemail. But that wasn't all. Mr. Abernathy also identified a specific phrase that Mark Olson frequently used during his initial interview, "You know what I mean?" He had said it several times, often at the end of a sentence, as a way of seeking confirmation or agreement. And that same phrase, albeit muffled and distorted, could be detected in the voicemail. "I'm confident," Mr. Abernathy announced, "that the voice in the voicemail is Mark Olson's. The speech patterns, the pronunciation, the phrase he uses, it all matches up." Harding and Ramirez exchanged a look of triumph. They had their concrete evidence. They had definitively linked Mark Olson to the voicemail, to the pleading words, to Sarah's potential distress. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," Ramirez said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've given us what we need." They now had probable cause to arrest Mark Olson. The seemingly airtight alibi had been shattered, the cooperative demeanor exposed as a facade. The muffled voice in the voicemail had spoken, and its message was clear: Mark Olson was their prime suspect. The detectives were ready to pounce. Justice for Sarah was finally within reach. Harding and Ramirez found Mark Olson at the nightclub where he worked, tending bar with his usual charming smile. But this time, his charm didn't work on them. They arrested him and brought him back to the precinct for questioning. In the interrogation room, Mark Olson maintained his innocence. He claimed he had no idea what they were talking about, that he hadn't seen Sarah in weeks, that he had been at a concert on the night she disappeared. Harding placed the enhanced voicemail on the table between them. "Recognize this, Mark?" Mark listened to the voicemail, his face paling slightly. "It's Sarah. Calling her mother." "Listen closely, Mark," Ramirez said, her voice cold and unwavering. "Do you hear anything else?" Mark listened again, his brow furrowed. "Just background noise. City sounds." Harding pressed play again, louder this time. The muffled voice, pleading and desperate, filled the room. "Don't. Please. Leave." Mark's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "That's your voice, Mark," Ramirez said, her gaze unwavering. "We had it analyzed. It's you, begging Sarah not to leave." Mark shook his head vehemently. "No, that's not me. I don't know what you're talking about." Harding leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "Don't lie to us, Mark. We know you were with Sarah that night. We know you argued. We know something happened." Mark continued to deny everything, his voice growing increasingly frantic. He insisted that he loved Sarah, that he would never hurt her. He claimed that the voicemail was a fabrication, a conspiracy to frame him. But Harding and Ramirez were relentless. They presented the evidence, one piece at a time, chipping away at Mark's carefully constructed facade. They showed him the spectrograms, highlighting the similarities between his voice and the voice in the voicemail. They played the recording of him saying, "You know what I mean," and pointed out the same phrase in the voicemail. The pressure began to mount. Mark's carefully constructed composure started to crumble. He fidgeted in his chair, his hands trembling, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Finally, after hours of interrogation, Mark Olson broke down. He sobbed uncontrollably, burying his face in his hands. Okay, he cried, his voice muffled. "I did it. I didn't mean to, but I did it." Harding and Ramirez exchanged a knowing look. They had finally cracked him. The truth, buried deep beneath layers of lies and deception, was about to surface. The long road to justice for Sarah Jenkins was nearing its end. The silence of the unsolved case was about to be broken. Mark Olson's confession was a torrent of remorse and self-pity, a desperate attempt to minimize his culpability. He claimed that he had never intended to hurt Sarah, that it was all a terrible accident. He explained that on the night of her disappearance, he had gone to Sarah's apartment to try and convince her to get back together with him. He had been unable to accept their breakup, consumed by jealousy and a desperate need to control her. They had argued, he said, their voices escalating, the tension in the small apartment thickening with each passing moment. Sarah had told him that she was seeing someone else, that she was happy without him, that she never wanted to be with him again. Mark claimed that he had lost control, his rage blinding him. He had grabbed Sarah, shouting at her, pleading with her to change her mind. She had pushed him away, and he had stumbled, accidentally knocking her against a sharp corner of a table. Sarah had fallen to the floor, unconscious. Mark said he panicked. He didn't know what to do. He checked her pulse, but couldn't find one. He was convinced that she was dead. In a state of shock and terror, Mark made the fateful decision to hide her body. He wrapped her in a blanket, carried her out of the apartment, and drove her to a remote location in the woods, a place he knew from hiking as a child. He dug a shallow grave and buried her there, covering the site with leaves and branches. He then returned to his apartment, cleaned up the mess, and tried to act as if nothing had happened. He went to the concert with his friends, providing himself with an alibi, hoping that he could get away with it. But the guilt had been eating away at him, he said. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, he couldn't escape the image of Sarah lying lifeless in the woods. He knew that he would eventually be caught, that justice would eventually catch up with him. Harding and Ramirez listened intently, their faces grim. They knew that Mark's confession was likely self-serving, that he was trying to downplay his role in Sarah's death. But they also knew that they had enough evidence to convict him, to bring him to justice for his crime. "Take us to her, Mark," Harding said, his voice stern. "Show us where you buried Sarah." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with tears. He agreed to cooperate, to lead them to the remote location where he had hidden Sarah's body. The first step towards closure had been taken. The family of Sarah Jenkins would soon have their answer. The drive to the remote wooded area was long and somber. Mark Olson, handcuffed and silent, sat in the back of the police car, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. Harding and Ramirez exchanged few words, the weight of the situation heavy on their hearts. The woods were dense and overgrown, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Mark led them through the trees, his steps hesitant, his face pale. After a while, he stopped, pointing to a small clearing. "It's there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Under the leaves." Harding and Ramirez approached the clearing cautiously. They could see a patch of disturbed earth, covered with a thin layer of leaves and branches. They knelt down and began to carefully remove the debris. Beneath the leaves, they found a shallow grave. And inside the grave, wrapped in a tattered blanket, was the body of Sarah Jenkins. The scene was heartbreaking. Sarah's lifeless form, her once vibrant face now pale and gaunt, was a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. Harding and Ramirez felt a wave of sadness wash over them, a profound sense of loss. They called in the forensics team, who carefully exhumed Sarah's body. The medical examiner confirmed that she had died from a blow to the head, consistent with Mark Olson's confession. The recovery of Sarah's body brought a measure of closure to her family. They finally knew what had happened to her, they finally had a place to mourn. But the pain of their loss was still raw, their grief still profound. Harding and Ramirez delivered the news to Robert and Mary Jenkins in person. The family was devastated, but they were also grateful to the detectives for their relentless pursuit of justice. They thanked them for never giving up, for bringing Sarah home. The recovery of Sarah's body solidified the case against Mark Olson. He was charged with murder and faced a lengthy prison sentence. Justice for Sarah Jenkins had finally been served. The silence that had haunted the detectives for so long was broken. Although they knew it wouldn't bring her back, they hoped it would at least bring peace to the family. Back at the precinct, the fluorescent light seemed a little less harsh, the air a little less heavy. The Sarah Jenkins file, now closed, sat on Harding's desk, a testament to their perseverance and the power of technology. Harding leaned back in his chair, a weary smile on his face. "You know, Ramirez," he said, "I was ready to give up on this one. I thought we had exhausted all the leads." Ramirez smiled back, her eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction. "I know, Harding. But you always taught me, there's always something more we can do. We just have to keep digging." "And you were right," Harding admitted. "That voicemail. It was a long shot, but it paid off. It's amazing what technology can do these days. Mr. Abernathy is a miracle worker." "It wasn't just the technology," Ramirez said. "It was your experience, Harding. Your ability to see the big picture, to connect the dots. And it was your guidance, that kept me focused." Harding chuckled. "Don't give me too much credit, Ramirez. You're the one who refused to give up. You're the one who found that voicemail. You're the one who pushed me to keep going." They sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the case, on the challenges they had faced, on the victory they had achieved. They had started with nothing, with no leads, no witnesses, no hope. But they had persevered, they had trusted their instincts, and they had used every tool at their disposal to uncover the truth. "This case reminded me why I became a detective," Ramirez said, her voice filled with renewed dedication. "To give a voice to the voiceless, to bring justice to the victims, to bring closure to their families." Harding nodded in agreement. "It's not always easy," he said. "There are days when you feel like giving up, when you feel like you're making no progress. But you can't. You have to keep going, you have to keep believing, you have to keep fighting for the truth. The Sarah Jenkins case had tested their partnership, had strained their relationship. But it had also strengthened their bond, had renewed their commitment to their profession. They were a team, a force to be reckoned with. And they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that together, they could overcome anything. As they prepared to leave for the day, Harding glanced at the Sarah Jenkins file one last time. He knew that he would never forget her, that her face would forever be etched in his memory. But he also knew that they had done everything they could to bring her justice, to give her peace. And that was something he could live with. The lights of the city twinkled, awaiting their next call. The next victim. The next mystery.